Alrighty, y'all, last session, and this is probably the heaviest of the four, because it is so vulnerable. It's been highly politicized, and it has come to a point where even trying to discuss these issues has been seen as an act of hate and harm. But we are not to fear discussions. We are not to have a spirit of fear, of meekness, but of boldness. And to witness and to love and to interact means that we are able to evaluate all things for truth, not accept everything as truth. There's a wonderful quote by a college professor. I'm going to butcher his name, so if you want his name, come see me after and we'll sound it out on my phone, because we don't want to be so open-minded that our brains fall out. And so when we look at this issue, what we want to do is we want to do it from a position of being open-minded. We want to evaluate everything for truth, and we want to do so in a Christ-honoring way, meaning we are not belittling or dehumanizing the folks that are involved, because the topics that we're going to discuss in here, I don't know of anything that is more vulnerable than questioning the core of who you are. I mean, that is a place of deep hurt and wounded. And if we go in there, like I said, like an attacker, then we can do more harm for the kingdom than good. But we also, because we are loving and because we do not tolerate falsehood, but instead rejoice in the truth, we do want to address these issues with truth, with grace. So as I said with the biblical sexuality talk in the morning session, we're going to approach this from evaluating an ideology, looking at the theology, scientific evidence. We're going to look at it from that perspective. But because we're looking at it from that perspective, it doesn't necessarily mean that how I approach it this way is how we need to articulate it to the individual, because again, there's wounds, there's hurts, there's vulnerabilities. So we have to be careful not to compromise truth, but to make sure that we are talking to people in a way that is respectful to them, because again, every person, regardless of what they believe, how they identify, how they dress, carry themselves, all of those things, every single person is made in the image of God. They may not be a child of God, but they are made in his image. And so we respect them as fellow image bearers in Christ. So today, we're going to look at how can we understand the LGBTQ ideology so that way we can better answer the questions that our kids have. So I never expected to ever step into this realm whatsoever. It actually came roaring into my life about 5-6 years ago. So I'm from Texas, but I'm not a native Texan. Yeah, as you know, I'm here, PHS Vikings. And so one thing that you may not know if you're a native Washingtonian is that Texas summers try very hard to kill you. And they really do. And so it is just frying hot outside, and being a mom of 3 kids, we were just trying to survive. And the only way I knew how to do that was we were just going to slam a whole box of popsicles and binge watch Nickelodeon, because that's how you make it through the 1 o'clock hour in Texas. And so we're watching this show called The Loud House. Have anybody ever seen it? So kind of a cute show. Some moms have seen it. Cute show, right? It's a cartoon about a boy who's trying to survive living in a 1,200 square foot house with 10 sisters. If you have one sister, you know what that's like. Can you imagine 10 of them in a tiny house? And so the whole series is just filled with hilarious shenanigans, because each of the girls have a different personality, and it's just fun to see them interact. And there was one episode called the Valentine's Day episode, to where there was a Valentine that appeared at the door addressed only to L. And because these parents, they decided to name all of their kids a name starting with L, so nobody knew who the Valentine was for. So they spent the entire episode encouraging each other to confront their crushes to see who got the secret Valentine. And there was one sister who she didn't want to confront her crush. She was too embarrassed. She was like, I don't want to talk to Sam, because if I talk to Sam, what if Sam doesn't like me? And her sisters are, no, you got to do it. You got to talk to Sam. So we see her write out her little Valentine love note, and every time the issue of Sam was raised, what it panned to was like the stereotypical grunge 90s heartthrob of a guy. Like, he had the hair, he looked deep and brooding, the dark plaid shirt, he had a guitar. He walked around middle school with a guitar. Who does that? But anyways, this is what we thought, and we were set up the whole episode to think this is Sam. And so finally at the end of the episode, sister puts the Valentine into the locker and promptly runs away, because that's just how you navigate love life in middle school. And we wait, and here comes Sam down the hall. And my kids and I are watching. We're like, oh my gosh, here comes the moment. They're going to meet Sam. And grunge boy with guitar comes up to the locker and then keeps on walking. But the girl that was always in the background, standing right behind him, stops and opens the locker, and she picks up the Valentine and she reads it, and she and the other girl, they connect and they do that whole cartoon googly eye thing, and then the scene cuts, episode over. It was all of 3 seconds, and if I had been on Pinterest, I would have completely missed it. But it was right there, and my first thought was, oh crap, what do I tell my kids? Because now they're going to be asking me questions. And I instantly started praying that my boys were going to be boys and be totally oblivious to everything they saw on the TV. And my younger two were, but my 10-year-old at the time was not. My oldest was not. And he looked at it, and he looked at me, and he goes, well, wait a second, Mom. 2 episodes ago, she was crushing on that British tutor, and she wanted to go out with him. And now she wants to date this girl? What is that? And I was like, oh my goodness. I have to explain bisexuality in children to my own kid. And I had absolutely no idea how to do that. And this is actually intentional. Our culture today has completely shifted. When we were like the millennial generation, what ushered in LGBTQ themes to TV wasn't just Friends. Within Friends, it was more of a punchline, but what really revolutionized LGBTQ presence within entertainment was the show Will and Grace. And it just made it accessible. Well, now it's completely shifted. It's no longer at an adult level. Now, during the months of May and June, you can flip on Bubble Guppies and Blue's Clues and find drag queens with Blue's Clues. And you can find same-sex parents with Peppa Pig. And it's everywhere, and it's intentional. There is the director of childhood education and early intervention, Christy Torrell Corbin, when she was observing how Sesame Street had introduced all different dynamics of families, whether it's heterosexual couples, same-sex couples. They did it very neutral, like, oh, your family likes to dance? So does mine. Your family likes to cook together? So does mine. It was very neutral, and she goes, oh my goodness, this is so great, because children, by nature, are very accepting. They will just accept it as truth. It's only later when they're taught biases that they begin to adopt these biases. Now switch out the word biases with Christian worldview, and you'll know the intention. And this is actually just proven, in fact, within history. Anytime an invading army was taking over a culture, more often than not, they would wipe out the adults, but instead assimilate the children or the young people. This is what happened to Daniel. Into the culture and start a very intensive indoctrination program. So the goal for kids, especially young children, is to introduce these themes very young. They want to make it colorful and attractive and fun and sparkly and all wrapped up in this bow of empowerment, inclusion, all of these things, because they know if they can get to the kids little, more often than not, mom and dad isn't going to start talking until ages 12 to 13. And by then, they have had 11, 12 years of laying down this foundation. So oftentimes I'm asked, when discussing this issue, let's go ahead and go, thanks. Oftentimes I'm asked, well, I don't want to talk to these things about my kids, because I just want to protect their innocence. I don't want to have these conversations. I know my parents didn't have to. Their grandparents never had to talk to them. I want to protect their innocence, and I completely understand that stance. I had that exact same perspective. I wanted to keep the world out, but there was a psychologist who said our role as parents is not to child-proof the world, but world-proof the child. And so can we keep it out? You can't. Honest to goodness, you cannot. Just full transparency. If your little baby associates with other tiny humans running around your neighborhood, they're getting this stuff. If they're watching TV, it's coming in on their cartoons, and it's subtle and it's quick, and if we're not paying attention, we'll miss it, but they won't. If they're plugged into a tablet or a phone as you're grocery shopping and you've just got cartoons playing, very often those cartoons, it's right there, and you might just be missing it. So the question with regards to protecting innocence is, can we keep them from LGBTQ messages? And the answer is no, we can't. It's just, this is how our world is right now. And is it biblical? I'm going to argue no, it's not. Because for us to be in the world, for us to be wise as serpents but gentle as doves, for us to wield the armor of God like what we talked about in that very first session, we have to first realize that we're on the battlefield. But Satan doesn't want your kids to know that, and he doesn't want you to realize that either. Because here's the thing, if we don't talk to our kids, we do not remove them from the battlefield, we remove ourselves from the battlefield. And now our baby is out there all alone, not knowing how to wield the armor of God effectively, and it makes them an easier target. It doesn't make them an effective Christian. But our role as Christians, as parents, the commands of God of training up our children, that's because we are to symbolically represent God in this process. And just like God does not abandon us in the valley of the shadow of death, we do not abandon our babies on the battlefield. Instead, we defend them while training them how to navigate these issues with truth and grace. And can we do so? Can we navigate these issues without looking like some of these folks on the news? It breaks my heart because some of the ways these issues are handled by newscasters or talk show hosts, they are very crude and crass and belittling. And do we have to be like them? Absolutely not. We can love like Christ while still not compromising truth. And that's what we got to do and nurture with our kiddos. Because so many more kids today, they're walking into their elementary school classrooms and encountering children who sometimes come dressed as a girl, sometimes dressed as a boy. I've had a woman speak to me, and she was in Wyoming. I flew out to Wyoming. I had to drive 2 hours through nothingness just to get through this town. And I was thinking, well, clearly none of this stuff can be here because this is like a little island in the midst of nothing of Wyoming. And one thing she first asked me is, hey, I've got my young daughter in her elementary school classroom, and there is one of her classmates identifying as a dog in the classroom, and the child barks in the middle of class in response to questions. How do I talk to her about this? So can we keep it out? No. Is it biblical? No, because we have to tactically engage it. But can we raise our kids to stand firm in truth and faith and witness to others while loving like Christ? 100%. But we got to understand what's going on in culture. So let's check out what's going on with LGBTQ ideology. We'll go ahead and go to the next one. So how did we get here? So we've talked a little bit about truth and the existence of truth and postmodernism. And within our Mama Bear book, our first Mama Bear book, that's the green one, we talk about how we had the modernist era and the postmodern era, and there was a blank space for what are we in now? Because Hillary and the early authors recognized that our culture has shifted with the idea of truth. And I'm going to just suggest, again, this hasn't been taught in philosophy classes or anything, but here's my theory. I think we're in what's called the meta-modernist era. Now, if you're familiar with the word meta, like metaverse, this is an alternate reality that we create. And so what meta-modernism is, so postmodernism, right? It was this idea of you have your truth and I have mine. It's kind of a live and let live philosophy. So what metamodernism has said, it's different. It goes, I have my truth, and my truth is now your truth. And now you have to change to affirm and recognize my reality. And look at what that does. So what that does is that basically everybody has a circle. And the circle is basically experience, a circle of experience. And what counts as truth is anything that validates, affirms, and passes through that experience filter. If it makes it through, then it's truth. And if it's my truth, it's also yours. Anything that doesn't affirm my truth, that gets tossed out. And it's no longer this fact-value split. It is now truth and harm. Because if it doesn't validate and affirm my experience, if it's not my truth, now it's harmful. And we're actually seeing this within culture. I've heard news stories about how mathematics is now being labeled racist and oppressive because it's oppressive to say that there is, 2 + 2 = 4. That's inappropriate. We can't be saying that. There have been schools that I've heard of that you can even get the wrong answer, but as long as you have a good enough reason why you got the wrong answer, you'll get full credit. And so we're seeing things being challenged. Biology is now being challenged. It's seen as harmful to say that male and female, XX and XY, to say that no, those are the only two sexes. That's now seen as inappropriate, as offensive. I've seen biologists, these are secular biologists, who have said that men are physiologically different from females. Their muscle structure, their bone structure is more dense than biological women. And I've seen people protest and walk out of these sessions. These are just biologists affirming reality. But because it doesn't pass through this filter of experience, it's not considered truth, it's labeled harm. Because if it's harm, now we can change legislature. Think of that relativistic stance. You have your truth and I have mine. Basically, everything is reduced to an opinion, and there's no power in opinions. We need objective truth for there to be power, for us to change legislature, make laws, that sort of thing. And so, for that to be the case, that's why we have to change our understanding of truth. And I think that is what's going on in culture. Again, I preface this is just from my studies, things that I've looked at within culture. I think this is where we're at now, and this kind of makes sense for how we're seeing things change within culture. Now, this idea, this split of sex and gender is actually fairly recent. It was kind of brought in through 1950s feminism. Initially, sex and gender were seen as synonymous, and we actually still operate a lot of this way. If you've just had a baby or if you're pregnant, a lot of women now are having what's called a gender reveal party. Right? Because if we called it a sex reveal party, that could be misconstrued, and we might get some awkward situations that happen within our party. That's because sex and gender were seen as synonymous. It was referring to biological reality. But within feminism, especially in the 1950s, there were many feminists that recognized that women were being oppressed simply for being women. They were mistreated. Ladies, you were not allowed to go to college. We could not go to college. It was considered a waste on us. And we were not smart enough, intelligent enough. All we needed to do was be in the kitchen making babies and cooking pies. That's what the belief system was. Ladies, you were not allowed to hold a bank account. If you wanted to have a bank card, you had to have your husband's permission first. Most women weren't allowed to do the finances because they weren't considered intelligent enough to do finances. Funny thing is, I think most of you, probably ladies, you're pretty involved in the finances, aren't you? So there was a French feminist by the name of Simone de Beauvoir, and she recognized this oppression on women simply because we were women, and she was very frustrated with it, and so she's changed her thought on how we are to see a woman. A woman isn't a biological reality. In fact, one of her key phrases, her statements is, one is not born, but one becomes a woman, and it's nodding to that womanhood, femininity, it's a social construct, it's not a reality, because if it can be a construct, well, then it can change. We can't be oppressed by it. We can't escape biological reality. But a social contract, that changes, that shifts with culture. And this was influential for another woman by the name of Judith Butler. She is a philosopher over in Berkeley University, and as a lesbian and a woman who doesn't really feel comfortable embracing sort of like feminine attire, attributes, that sort of thing, she was really burnt out on stereotypical understanding of femininity. She was also really frustrated with what's called the heteronormative, meaning she was frustrated by the ideal couple being male and female. And so she wanted to break this down. Her whole book, Gender Trouble, is about breaking down these concepts of objective male and female. No, instead she says gender is not something one is, it's something one does. It's an act, it's a doing rather than being. So when we dress and portray ourselves a certain way, that is us acting, that is creating our gender. And that has directly shaped how a lot of our kids are being taught within school on this concept of sex and gender. So there was this split. Sex now refers to biological, who you are biologically, which, by the way, your sex is coded to your very DNA. It's coded to your very DNA. But now we have this concept of gender, and gender has now been elevated to this is the sum total of who you are. So most kids are taught something like this. Now, you're actually not going to see the genderbread person a lot in your school's curriculum. They will use a unicorn instead, because a unicorn, it's easier to look at a unicorn and not know male or female, so that's why they typically use a unicorn. And this is how they break apart the person. The person is broken up into 4 pieces, though with a gender unicorn, sometimes you'll see 5, and one of them is emotional attraction. They'll divide a person. Who do you like to talk to most? Who do you like to be friends with most? Like growing up, being in the military, I was logistics. I worked on a flight line with AWACS A-10s. I hung out with guys. It was awesome. Guys are so easy to hang out with. If you make them laugh and bring them chips, they let you hang out. It's great. So how they do this is first, you have this concept of identity. Remember how we talked about worldview claims and who we are, what is reality? So identity, that's how you feel in your head. That's how you experience and define your gender based on how much you align with gender stereotypes. And so you have the stereotypes, and if you are more into like rough and tumble play, playing out in the mud, the dirt, climbing trees, if you are more that, well, that's more on the masculine side. If you are more soft-spoken and artistic, you like painting, arts and crafts, macrame, you could care less about football, well, that's more on the feminine side. And so gender is how you internalize, how you see yourself. Then you have attraction. That's who you're romantically attracted to. So whether it's male, female, both, that's attraction. Then you have sex. That refers to your biology. And your expression is how you dress to reflect how you see yourself. Now, some people have more of a fluid expression. You will see some guys. There was a gentleman in Macy's just yesterday that was checking me out at the checkout counter, and he wore a pearl necklace and had some eyeliner. There could be that, or there could be a gentleman dressing as a female dressing as a male. This all varies. Oftentimes, your expression will reflect how you see yourself, though not always, but they usually correlate. And as Jordan Peterson, a psychologist, points out, it usually is tied into who you're attracted to as well. So out of these four, which one do you think is most important in culture today? Identity. Identity is seen as the most important thing about you today. What do you think is least important? Sex, your biology, least important. At best, your biology, your body, is just kind of this neutral ground. It's irrelevant, but at worst, it's seen as a problem. It's a stumbling block. It's in your way from who you truly are. So what kids are told is that because gender is this concept of gender theory, this is what's actually true about you. There is no such thing as boy and girl. You actually figure that out as you grow older based on what you like and who you're attracted to and how closely you align to a stereotype. And then what you can do is you can dress to express that. You can even have surgeries. In fact, in the American Girl Body book that was just released last summer, what they said, if you feel like you're different, that's okay. You can go and get medicine and have surgeries. It's totally okay to change your bodies. That's what they told girls 7 to 11 years old. But is that true? Does that actually reflect reality? But that's what our kids are told. And it's based on kind of this understanding of gender dysphoria. So gender dysphoria is where a person will feel deeply disconnected, deeply uncomfortable within their own body. And one of the questions that's often asked, especially with kids, is whether or not gender dysphoria exists. And it does. 100% gender dysphoria exists, but not at the rates that we're seeing it today. So gender dysphoria was studied extensively by Dr. Zucker. He was a Canadian specialist who worked specifically with children, and he had his office for like 30 years. It was incredible. And what he noticed is that there's this understanding of gender dysphoria. It's early onset gender dysphoria. This is most common in boys. Boys will suffer with this more than girls, and it starts becoming noticeable around the ages of 3 and 4. So what this is, you'll have a little boy who is very insistent, very persistent. No, I am a girl. I'm not supposed to be a boy. They always want to play with hyper girl things, dress up in girls' clothes. They're very insistent upon this. And you'll have early onset gender dysphoria in these young boys. But there's also what has become more common today is rapid onset gender dysphoria. And rapid onset gender dysphoria occurs predominantly in teen girls, not young boys. And what happens is this girl, usually she's already gone through puberty, and what will happen is this girl will be completely comfortable being a girl, and then all of a sudden she comes home one day and is like, no, I'm actually a boy, and I want you to call me Tristan or Carl or whatever it be, and she'll try to change her expression, and it'll seemingly come out of nowhere. And what's interesting is how our gender-affirming care works today was actually based on a study done in Norway in 2014, but they've kind of tweaked their approach. So in Norway, they recognize that gender dysphoria is an actual condition, but they were very guarded in how they treated it. Because what was recognized, and this is validated by Dr. Zucker as well, is that a child's perception of their identity, it fluctuates throughout their youth, and especially in young children, it's very malleable. Children can be pushed into things, pushed out of things. They can decide one thing one minute and change it the next. It fluctuates greatly, which is why, especially Dr. Zucker, his primary treatment method for young children, boys specifically, but also girls as well, is, okay, we're not going to affirm that this child, if in the case of a boy, is actually a girl. Instead, we're going to ask questions like, why do you think that you are a girl? What makes you think that way? And sometimes it's based on false gender expectations. Well, boys are supposed to be loud and rough, and I don't like being with the loud and rough boys. I like hanging out and talking to the girls. Okay, you're still a boy. You just don't like the rough and tumble stuff. That doesn't make you a girl. Oh, you like these pink and purple things. That's okay. Boys can wear pink. You see it all the time on Easter or on my husband loves watching golf, and he loves the more vibrant outfits. You see it all the time, but that doesn't necessarily make them a girl. And so what Dr. Zucker would do is he had a wait-and-see approach to these young children. And instead, he would just encourage the parents, look, you don't have to affirm that your son is a girl. Instead, just what are his likes? Get him into a community of people with similar likes. Does he like dancing? Okay, enroll him in a dance class. Connect him with other boys who like dance or theater or art. And what he did is he allowed the children to sort of grow into who they were. And what they found, what studies have found, is between 70 and 90% of children who suffer from gender dysphoria actually come to accept and be completely comfortable and okay with their biological bodies, as long as they're allowed to progress through puberty normally, and usually by the time of 19, they're completely comfortable in their bodies. So this 2014 study in Norway recognized this. So they had a very stringent filtering process on how they treated gender dysphoria. So if it was a young child, a very young child who was insistent and persistent, for one, they recognized that these are just characteristics of being a toddler. They kind of had a wait-and-see approach, but they also investigated underlying psychological disorders. So Lisa Littman did a wonderful study, especially on rapid onset gender dysphoria in teen girls, because it caused a spike within gender dysphoria occurrences among girls. And I think in the UK, they had a spike of 4,400% increase of these girls identifying as boys. And so what was recognized is oftentimes gender dysphoria can be caused by an underlying co-occurring psychological disorder, such as depression, anxiety. There's also, I believe, 30% autistic, if they're on the autistic or OCD spectrum. And why is that? Because autistic and OCD individuals, they hyper-focus on one thing, and they often just throw themselves and immerse in it. There's a, there was a show, I'm blanking on the name, it'll come to me at a random time, and I'll just shout it out. There was a show about a boy who was autistic. He was a teen, and he was hyper-focused on penguins. Every conversation he had focused on penguins. Often what they see within OCD and autistic kids, they hyper-focus on one thing. And children who are autistic often just naturally feel uncomfortable with who they are. And if they're searching for an explanation, well, LGBTQ ideology offers that explanation for why you're uncomfortable. This is especially popular within teen girls. So what happens in the teenage years, boys and girls deal with adversity, frustration, anger fairly evenly or equally up until the time they're teenagers. And then when the puberty kicks off, boys will deal with their frustrations and aggressions externally. Maybe they're going to be punching, wrestling, raw manhood, more often than not. Girls internalize their negative feelings. And so what girls do is they stop talking about their negative feelings, but what they will do is start looking for a solution, for a reason. And so many girls, especially during COVID, when they were cut off from their community of friends, they transitioned to going to online communities. And Reddit and Quora and all of these places had LGBTQ communities that were like, are you feeling uncomfortable in who you are? Do you feel like you don't fit in as a girl or as a boy? Maybe it's because you're actually trans. You're in the LGBTQ. Now, this can be really attractive, especially if you have a girl who's feeling uncomfortable. She doesn't fit those stereotypes. I was one of those girls. I was not a girly girl. I was up the tree. I was climbing. Heck, I joined the military and had a blast at basic training. Who does that? But for girls who are looking for an answer, this can be it. But oftentimes, transgenderism is a symptom, not necessarily a cause. And the study in Norway recognized this. So if an individual who is suffering from gender dysphoria, if they had a co-occurring depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, if these things occurred, they actually would not allow them to transition, especially as teens, because they recognized, wait a second, the underlying issue could actually be the depression, the anxiety, a stress, abuse going on in the home, and they looked into it. They also wouldn't allow children to change prior to the age of 18. There would be no surgeries, no hormones, none of those things, again, because they recognize that by the time they're teenagers, especially if they're able to go through puberty, the hormones released during puberty actually help people come to grips with who they are. And besides, puberty is just uncomfortable. Nobody feels comfortable during it. But so often we confuse discomfort in puberty for gender dysphoria, but that's not always the case. Sometimes it is, but sometimes not. And so they recognized this, so they had these strict standards. So this is how Norway would do things. Well, the US saw this, but instead they completely disregarded so much of that. They don't look, oftentimes when it comes to gender affirming care, they do not look into the psychological background of the child first. Some will, but many will not. In fact, in Oregon, a 15-year-old can go to Planned Parenthood, and after about an hour, they can be put on hormone therapy just by answering a few questions and signing a consent form that says they recognize what could happen to them if they take these chemicals. Most children don't actually truly grasp what can happen to them when they take hormone blockers or testosterone. Estrogen, for one, is a carcinogen. If a male starts taking estrogen, he's at an increased risk of cancer. That's why a lot of birth control, even when you look at birth control like Depo-Provera, what that does is that actually causes bone density issues. And what they're finding with a lot of these gender hormones, they don't want children on them for a long time because it actually affects their bone density. They can have brittle bones afterward. It can stunt their growth, not as well as their physical development. But within the US, because they hyper-focused on gender-affirming care, these sorts of things were disregarded in the sake of, no, I'm just going to affirm the child. So this would be like if you went to the hospital and you said, hey, I Googled my symptoms on WebMD and it says I'm dying. Can you please take out these organs? And the doctor said, cool, I'll scrub up, get on the table. That would not be good health care. But that's kind of how gender affirming care works a lot of the time within the US, because it's, oh, I feel like I am a different gender. All right, let's get you on hormone blockers. And then let's start socially transitioning you. Let's change your name. Let's change how you present yourself, how you dress. And this was not done in Norway. This wasn't done by Dr. Zucker. He actually said, no, you don't want to socially transition your child, because even though, putting him in a dress or putting her with a short haircut and making her look masculine and giving her a boy name, even though all of those things are reversible, when you start doing things publicly within your school, the friends in the friend group don't forget. And very oftentimes they will pick on the kid because of it. So he affirmed a wait-and-see approach, but that's not encouraged anymore. In fact, Dr. Zucker, he was the leading mind within gender-affirming care within Canada. Papers were written by him that people use everywhere. His practices were common until he went into work one day and he was called into the office of his superiors, and they said, hey, so how you've been doing your work, the grants and stuff you've been approved, that's no longer in line with the new way of thinking. You're fired. And your work is invalidated. He lost all credibility. And now, because of the adoption of affirming care, which is done by the World Health Organization, children's medical associations, because they're focused on that, they've completely disregarded all of this prior research. And oftentimes, affirming care is completely whitewashed for the sake of just validating and affirming the child without stopping to ask, wait a second, is this really going on? Is this the real issue? As we can see up here, there are multiple instances, alternate causes for gender dysphoria that show that gender dysphoria is actually a symptom, not always a cause. There was one girl, I read her story, to where she wanted to identify as a boy. And the psychologist she was speaking to just asked, okay, well, why do you feel this way? Why do you feel like you're a boy? And she goes, well, there's boys at school that have been tormenting and abusing me in the classroom, and my teachers aren't listening to me. And if I were a boy, they wouldn't abuse me. So I want to be a boy. She wasn't actually suffering from gender dysphoria. She was recognizing abuse, but the solution to that abuse wasn't the right one. But if this psychologist hadn't stopped to ask her why, she would have just been put on hormone therapy and moved through the system. So that's why it's important for us to, what do kids need to know about this? Because especially depending on your school district and the stance that they take, gender theory, which was often reserved for feminist studies in college level, is now being repackaged to kindergartners. You can actually, there are actually daycares nowadays that you can put your 2-year-old in this daycare. It's a gender-affirming daycare to where they do like pride projects and that sort of thing. So they're taught this from the time they're toddlers. And like I mentioned before, Blue's Clues, Bubble Guppies, Craig of the Creek, Loud House, it's in nearly every cartoon. In fact, the only cartoon I haven't seen it in is Bluey. It's the only one. So what do kids need to know? So what kids need to know is I've got this list of affirmations that we can give each kid. For one, we recognize that boys and girls are made in God's image. And this is Genesis 1:27. Male and female, he made them. In his image, he made them male and female. It's repeated 3 times, often seen attributing as acknowledging the Trinity. And what's being warped today is there's actually the very first Anglican non-binary priest, this is in England, And what he said is that, well, when I was reading Genesis 1:27, yes, it says he made them male and female, but what the Spirit told me is that he made them in maleness and femaleness. So it doesn't matter what you are biologically. If you feel more male, then you're male. If you feel more female, you're female. And he had a family and children. He now identifies as non-binary, and he operates his priestly duties from that standpoint. And he says there he's so excited to be able to talk to kids and let them know that there's a place for this non-binary identity. But when we actually look at Scripture, and this is an aspect of queer theology, which we'll get to in a second, when we look at Scripture, we see, no, God made them male and female. Rooted in biology, it's that creation that cries out to the Creator with purpose. Another thing we can tell our kids, your body matters. Manhood and womanhood have range, which I'll get to in just a second. Probably most importantly, stereotypes describe some, they do not define all. If womanhood is purely described as this stereotype of looking like Elle Woods from Legally Blonde, not many of us ladies are going to match that, me especially. If masculinity is just raw manhood, beard, chicken wings, plaid shirt, if that's all what masculinity is, and I know the bearded guys are laughing right now, I'm picking on you on purpose. My husband has a beard, I can do that. If that's all manhood is, then the quieter men, the clean-shaven guys, the guys that are interested in sports within the church are going to feel left out. And I'm not just making this up. I've actually seen this on Twitter by multiple men who have tweeted about how they do not feel at place within the church because of this concept of masculinity that's a stereotype. It is not actual reality. And our stereotypes, they don't determine our worth. How closely you looked like a buxom beauty does not mean that you are less valuable when you don't. Same with manhood. You don't have to be able to bench 315 to be considered a man. You're still a man. We'll see that here in just a second. So what do our kids need to know besides these wonderful little mantras that we can speak over our kids, and it's things that can come to mind with them? We need to teach the concept of what is biblical masculinity. And within biblical manhood and biblical womanhood, it's based on two things: biological sex and godly character traits. That's what it's based upon. And we can see this in Scripture. When we look at Scripture, probably one of the best examples are Jacob and Esau. So you all know who Jacob and Esau is. Esau, dude had a beard from the time he was 8. He was all about hunting, and the man, if you're one of these Bear Grylls, you're going to wilderness camps like Esau, right? His father loved him for it because he was that raw, stereotypical manhood. But then you have Jacob. And how is Jacob described? Quiet, sweet, soft-spoken. He hung out with the ladies in the tents cooking. He probably smelled a ton better than his brother Esau. And do we ever read in Scripture of God going, oh man, Jacob, I was going to pick you to be a leader of Israel, but you're a super wimp, so I'm going to go with Esau instead? No, he didn't. He still worked through Jacob, and it's wonderful. Same with Joseph. I love the story of Joseph because here he was captive. He was brought into Potiphar's household, and when his boss's wife threw herself on him, instead of being like, oh, sweet, she's good looking, I'm going to hit that, he fled the scene. No, I say that for a reason because here's the thing. So often within our culture, masculinity is determined by how many women you sleep with. Like, why wouldn't you go after that chick? Oh, she wanted you. Aren't you a man? I mean, think of all these movies like 40-Year-Old Virgin or any sort of virgin character in a TV show. They're often belittled and depicted as goofy and silly and ridiculous and ignorant. And that's intentional because they want to belittle God's design, the beauty of waiting until marriage. They want to degrade it. And so that's why they target it, and that's why they hyper-focus on elevating this hookup lifestyle while downgrading the realities that so many men and women who engage in these hookups feel depressed and more anxious afterward. I know, I've met them. I've actually seen, there was one girl, she was 17, she was showing me these scars on her hands and on her side from where she tried to take her own life because she'd been connecting with all of these guys, just wanting someone to know her, to love her. And instead, she'd connect with them on Tinder, sleep with her, and then they leave. And she spoke to me afterwards. She goes, it wasn't until today that I heard the gospel and realized I had value. Because the secular worldview that she had bought into, she heard the worldview claims of who she was loud and clear, that she was worthless, that guys only wanted her for 20 minutes and they didn't want to have her afterward. They didn't want to know who she was. And it wasn't until she heard Scripture that she realized, wait a second, I am precious. I am valuable. And it was wonderful. But here we have another great example of manhood in Joseph, who fled sexual temptation because he didn't want to sin against God. That is wonderful. Our boys need to do that. New Testament Joseph, also great, because here we have a man who is willing to step up and nurture and love a child who wasn't even his. That is wonderful. It's one of the reasons I love the show The Mandalorian, because we finally have a show that actually elevates and shows, man, masculinity and taking care of a kid, that's noble. Love it. That's what our kids need to know. Baby, if you're a man, you don't have to be rough and tumble to be a man. You can be soft-spoken. You can be artistic. You can paint. You can do art. You can dance. David danced naked. I recommend clothes. But he did. And that's all an aspect of manhood. It's wonderful. Same with womanhood. There is immense range within womanhood. We have the Marys who are helping out behind the scenes, the Marthas who are cooking and providing for, the Joannas who are businesswomen. But you know who we also have? We have Deborah. Deborah, who was a leader over Israel, not because the men weren't stepping up for the work, but because she was the best person for the job. And she gave wisdom and advice to her community, and she followed Barak to the edge of the battlefield and cheered on the Israelite armies as they took down the Canaanites. This chick was tough and brave. You also have Jael. I love Jael. Stay-at-home wife, right? Sisera comes in. I saw the hand gesture, Stephen. Comes in, wants her to compromise her faith and hide him from the Israelite army. So this chick gives him hot milk to make him sleepy. And then when he passes out, she tents his head to the ground with a tent spike. Proof you don't mess with godly housewives. We get stabby. So I'm kidding. Don't stab people. I heard a speaker say that, and I just absolutely loved it. But some of us have Deborahs in our household, little Deborahs. They are right there, and they are fierce and loving for God, and they have no problem going to the edges of the battlefield and defending friends for tooth. We've got Jaels in our household who love God so much that they will go and also meet up for confrontation and be able to defend the faith. Now, we may have to work with tact with them, but that's still a godly attribute of womanhood, is standing firm just as much as Martha, who served within the homes. It is not your personality, your hobbies, what you like to do not determine who you are. They do not determine your gender. They just explain things that you like to do. And they shift throughout your lifetime. I absolutely hated dresses as a little girl, and now I've got a ton of them in my closet. I loved climbing trees and being in the mud. I still do. I'm still a woman. And this is what we need our kids to know, is when we actually understand biblical masculinity and femininity, what happens is we completely debunk gender theory, because so much of gender theory is based on relevant today cultural stereotypes that wouldn't even last 50, 60 years. To put that in context, in the Victorian era, boys were to be dressed in pink because pink is a loud and boisterous color, just like boys, whereas girls were supposed to be dressed in blue because that was more demure and calm, like little girls. It shifts with culture. These sort of how we understand femininity, how we dress might change with culture. But again, sex exists, male and female exists, and it's not determined by your personality, what you like to do, even some of the clothes that you wear. It's not determined by that. There is range within masculinity and femininity within God's design, and it's beautiful and it's wonderful. Another thing we need to explain within LGBTQ ideology is marriage, the concept of marriage, because kids get hung up on words. And my kids wrestled with this. I had ladies that messaged me through our Facebook, and we wrote a whole blog on it. Their kids were stumbling with the concept of marriage because they said, well, if a boy and a girl can get married, and that's called marriage, and two men can get married, or two women can get married, and that's marriage, then why is that wrong? Why is that different? They didn't understand, because that marriage word tripped them up. So what we need to explain to our kids is there's a difference between biblical marriage and civic or civil marriage. So biblical marriage was God's institution. It's the first institution he created. It's symbolic of his relationship with his people to the church. It has purpose. It has design. However, culture wanted their own definition. And so what culture has done is created civic or civil marriage. Civic and civil marriage aligned with biblical marriage up until about 2016 with the overturning of Obergefell. And what happened is now marriage is no longer one male, one female. It is now two consenting adults is how it's defined. So civic marriage is determined by the government and often reflects culture, but it doesn't reflect the image of God. And so that's how we explain it to our kids. As baby, biblical marriage, it is God's design, it's purposeful, it's male and female. Because within male and female, that not only reflects the nature of God and his relationship to the church, it's also the only union possible of creating children. So children are not accidents, they're actually symbolic of the flourishing that happens when we're united with Christ. Civic and civil marriage, while it's determined by the government, it doesn't reflect the nature of God. Right now, it's two consenting adults, but we're actually seeing changes within the United States today that even the number two is coming under question. Within Utah, laws are being changed to where polygamous marriages have basically been reduced to like a traffic ticket fine. Pay $35 and you're out of there and you can have your 3 wives. And so we're seeing this shift within culture, and I wouldn't be surprised if this changes here in the next 5 to 10 years. I've also seen other states to where age limits are now being removed, to where you don't have an age limit on the marriage. So these things are changing within culture, but that doesn't change God's design. Instead, it's a corruption of it, so we can explain the difference. Now, what happens if you've got a family member who has a same-sex partner and they decide to get married? What do you tell your kids? So I've got a blog on this. It's called When Adam and Steve Come to Dinner. You can look at it on Mama Bear Apologetics. But what you do with your kids is, for one, you want to tell them exactly who they're meeting before they get there. Because children, when they're surprised by something, they channel Morgan Freeman. And they have this really loud voice, and they ask a really awkward question in front of everybody, and then you're put on the spot. You want to avoid that. So what we do is we're both proactive and reactive. So proactive, tell them who they're going to meet. This is Uncle Adam. And Uncle Adam actually has a boyfriend. His name is Steve, and they're deciding to get married. Now, people choose who they want to get married, and he's chosen to marry Steve. He's attracted to men. We want to tell them about God's design. Baby, this is God's design for relationships and marriage. But people can choose not to follow that design, and that is what they have chosen to do. But is Adam and Steve, are they made in God's image? 100%. So we treat them with dignity and respect. Give your kids talking points. Oh, Adam loves football. This is his favorite team. He likes the Phillies. So go ahead and talk about how Dallas is amazing. You know, give your kids talking points. That's to pick a fight, by the way. Give them talking points to talk about the individual, and then let your kids know, because your child, especially if your child has accepted Christ as their Savior, they can often feel very burdened to reach another in Christianity. And sometimes they can feel like, oh, I need to go and rush over to my adult uncle and just slam him and tell him about how we need Jesus and that sort of thing. So what you want to do is tell your child, look, baby, it is me, the adult. I am responsible for accountability, for talking to your uncle, that sort of thing. That's not your responsibility. So not for you right now. We understand God's design. We don't want to belittle the individual. We can talk to them. We're going to love them like Jesus, but that's not your responsibility to, again, confront them on their sexuality. And then so allow your kids, say, go play with cousins, go play. But if you have a question, wait until we're on the drive home, and then you can ask me whatever you want, baby. And so now your kid has an ability, okay, I know mom and dad are going to talk to me afterward. Whatever question is fair game, because we have that no flinch rule. And you can talk and have discipleship with your family. Now I get often asked, well, if I have a same-sex family member who's attracted to the same sex, how do I talk to them? And the question that I always ask first is, are they a believer? If the answer is no, then don't worry about their sexuality. That's not what you need to be talking about. Instead, we need to be ministering them from an evangelistic perspective and helping them come to know Christ, and then allow the Holy Spirit to work within their own life should they choose to accept Christ. So don't worry about the sexuality aspect. This is good for your teens, too. If they've got an unbelieving friend who is wrestling with their gender identity or their sexuality, and they feel, well, don't I need to confront them on this? Well, for one, if they know you're a Christian, they probably already know your stance. And two, the big question is, what is their faith with Jesus? If they do not have one, that's where we start. That's where we focus. Lastly, can I be an ally? This is the biggest question that we have now. So LGBTQ, it used to be LGBTQ. Now we've got the plus to allow for two-spirit, for all sorts of things. But the one big letter that's in there now that isn't often written is A, and that's for ally. And so many people, because LGBTQ ideology says you're either for us, this is Jojo Siwa, I'm quoting, the little girl, well, she's an adult now, that your probably daughter loved, Jojo Siwa. She said, you're either for us or you're in our way. And so to be an ally is a way to get on the right side of history, so to speak. And to be an ally is not to be a silent partner. That's the thing. This is not a tolerance standpoint, meaning like this is the lifestyle you have chosen. I'm going to be respectful of you. I'm going to treat you with respect. We'll have good conversations, but I'm not going to affirm your lifestyle. That's not what an ally is. To be an ally, you have to be actively involved in promoting the LGBTQ ideology and cause. You have to promote, defend, embrace, and endorse it very publicly. Otherwise, your silence is violence. So can we be an ally? Let's go to the next slide. We're seeing this now creep in culture. In Texas, we had a huge split within the Methodist Church on whether or not they were going to be affirming. In fact, there's a new thing now. It's called queer theology. And what this is it's theology through the lens of queer ideology. Now, if you look at the name queer theology, what you have is an adjective and a noun. And if you remember from English, the adjective modifies the noun, meaning it changes it. So queer theology, it changes theology. It changes the word of God. It omits it. It rewrites it to affirm the ideology. It doesn't come to Scripture first for truth. It's already adopted its truth, and now it picks the Scriptures that affirm it. That's queer theology, and that's what's working into our churches. That's why we're seeing things like, in fact, in the Church of England, they're actually debating now, the whole Church of England is debating whether or not to allow gender-neutral pronouns to refer to God, no longer calling him God the Father. That's oppressive. Or referring to him when he refers to himself as male. We're going to leave that part out. They're wrestling with that right now. That's queer theology. So what is the worldview behind it? So the LGBTQ worldview, in a lot of ways, it aligns with sex positivity worldview. But there's different changes here. And again, not everyone within the LGBTQ community affirms this. Please don't mistake what I'm saying, but this is just some of the overarching themes that I see common within LGBTQ worldview. And one of the biggest, what I want you to notice is who are human beings. Some will appeal to evolution, but some will appeal what I'm calling neo-imago Dei. And I've seen this with Nadia Boltz-Weber. And what this is they will recognize that we are made in the image of God. So yes, we are made in God's image. Therefore, I can live my life and do whatever I want with my body, and it's holy. That's the conclusion. So that's neo-imago Dei. It doesn't matter what I do, who I love, how I live my life. As long as I am loving and respectful and I engage in a pleasurable and consensual relationship with another person or another several persons, then it's good. That's what we see. In human history, it's hetero-patriarchal oppression. If male, female, if that's the priority, that's oppressive. If we're going to say that men are men, XX, XY, women are women, that's oppressive. That's dangerous. Inauthenticity, inequality, those are all the sins. And salvation is found in affirming only care, hormone therapy, surgeries, equality, and changing our entire understanding of who we are as men and women. That's what we're seeing within the LGBTQ worldview. So, can we align with this as Christians? And the answer is no, because this completely disregards the design of God. It invalidates his design, his boundaries, his guidelines. It disregards and invalidates his design for sex and the body and flourishing. It denies who he is. So can we align with that? Can we align with falsehood and still be Christians? We cannot. So no, we cannot be an ally. But does that mean that we are to treat people horribly? Or does that mean that we can't have a relationship with folks with a different worldview than us? No, that's absolutely false. We can still love people like Jesus. And how do we do that? By looking to his example. I mentioned before in the previous talk, when we look at his interaction with the woman at the well and Zacchaeus in the tree, we see Jesus, he knows their sin, but he also knows that he loves them and that they need God. And so he eats with them. He recognizes them as human beings to reach them for truth, and he never compromises truth and faith. And that's what we do with our kids. We teach them at baby, if somebody wants you to affirm them instead, like the pronoun debate's always big. How do I use pronouns? And there's debate within the Christian community on whether or not to use pronoun hospitality, meaning that you will use someone's preferred pronouns or not. So Preston Sprinkle runs a ministry, and he errs more on the side of pronoun hospitality, but only for adults. Because adults, they've often wrestled with who they are for a while. This is what they're believing. He wants to have a door open for ministry, so he will use their pronouns. But he will not use it for children. Because children, their understanding of who they are, they're still working on it. They're still coming to the comprehension. He doesn't want to affirm a falsehood in a child. Now, there's others who are staunchly against it, because if you say that a male is a female, you're affirming a falsehood, and we are not to lie, so they will not do it. I like Elisa Childers' stance. She kind of takes a middle ground. Instead, what she asks is, look, I understand and want to be respectful of you, but me personally, I cannot use your preferred pronouns. Instead, would it be all right, can I just use your name? And then use their name instead. And that puts the ball in their court to continue the relationship. Can we just have a relationship? I still want to work on the school project with you, or we can work in the office together. I'm going to be respectful of you, but I can't affirm this. Is that okay? And hopefully, the relationship will be able to progress, and they'll be respectful of your feelings. Because again, respect and tolerance, it's a two-way street. It's not one way to align just with one aspect of culture. But if they don't, if they say no, say, okay, I love you. Pray for them still. Again, when we look at Ephesians 6, we recognize that we're given the armor of God because our battle isn't just physical, it isn't just ideological, it's spiritual. And so much work can be done on the battlefield, the prayer field. Christopher Yuan was a homosexual man, lived his lifestyle for 20 plus years. His mother prayed for him every single day to come to Christ. And he did after 20 years. And now he lives a celibate lifestyle, and he ministers to people not only on sexuality, but his own coming to faith alongside his mom. St. Augustine, 20 years of his parents praying for him, his mother praying for him to come to faith. Prayer is a long haul game. Are you willing to be in it for the long haul for somebody else? That's how we love like Christ, is recognizing who they are, who they need desperately, and being that open door policy. But if they want to cut off the relationship, just like with the prodigal sons, if they want to leave, okay, I'll step back. But I'm going to pray for you. And I'm going to prayerfully watch for you. And when you come back, if you come back, boy, am I going to celebrate and throw a party. That's how we love like Christ. So pouring into your kids, teaching those foundational issues that we've just talked about, building up on their foundations of who is man, what is woman, what is the purpose of sexuality, marriage, truth and theology, and then as they get older, how do I address this in a Christ-honoring way to maybe my friends or my family member? That is how we build up these kiddos and help them to stand firm in culture without compromising their faith against the cultural tide.